Heyo, Tish here, and this is the start of a 3-part guide series on Rabbit and Steel. How to use each class, their ability rotations, what mechanics that the class may have, and some things that you should know about the character when you use them. So, I've been playing Rabbit and Steel for over 120 hours at this point, and I've really enjoyed the game. This is one of my top games already of 2026. I played the base game, then I found out the DLC was releasing, and it's even better. In this part, we're going to cover the default already unlocked characters, and then in the next 2 parts, I'll cover the unlockable characters that are in the base game, as well as the unlockable characters in the extra mode. So, to start off, this guide is primarily for new players of Rabbit and Steel who are maybe not familiar with all of the mechanics yet. So I'll just cover them right now. So your character here, you control them with the arrow keys, and they have abilities that correspond to keys. So you have your primary, your secondary, your special, and then your defensive. So for most characters, your defensive is your invulnerability. It usually gives you some form of invul. In this case, Wizards gives some brief invul, which you can see either by the character flashing, or I have a trinket here called the Ruby Gem that will glow for the amount of time that you have invul. So the rotation for each character I'll cover like so. I'll just first go through what their general usage rotation is, and then whatever mechanics after that. So for Wizard has a offensive, defensive that grants Astra, which is a 15% damage buff. So normally you want to defensive, secondary, special, and then use your primary to hopefully reset your special. If you can't get it, at some point cast your secondary so that way you can charge your special. So the loop is pretty much just, okay, it's still on cooldown, okay, it's up, I'll cast it, and then I can just hopefully reset the special and cast it again. Now I also want to cover some things that you might want to know about the character, such as what abilities might slow down a character, which is important because of movement. So you'll notice that here, the surrounding circle that you can see around my character, that is considered 1 rabbit leap, which will be useful to know for other characters. Now, with Wizard, what you want to know is that the primary slows you down a lot. You can see it's practically a stop movement. It's quite slow. Your secondary doesn't slow you down, your special doesn't slow you down, and your defensive does not slow you down. So you ideally want to cast your primary when you know that you're safe. You don't want to cast it while you're being attacked. There are upgrades that can remove that movement penalty, like the emerald one here. You can see I'm no longer slowed down, but it is worth noting. Now, what Wizard's core mechanic is pretty much tied to the defensive, which usually gives some form of buff. So without upgrades, it gives you Astra. With upgrades, this can change. So for example, a more potent Astra, Ghost, Nova, Rabbit Luck. Other effects are just like a base damage increase. I might as well add on for Wizard right now that Wizard's attacks are all ranged. So there's very little concern with actually missing your attack. So Wizard's a very beginner-friendly character in that sense. I would just, note the slowdown. Essentially, you're basically stopping when you use the primary. The slow's movement is quite severe. Just like so. There we go. Now for the next character, we have Assassin. So Assassin's bread and butter is very much using the defensive, a special, and then using the primary until you reset your defensive and then use your special again. Now, once the cooldown for your defensive is less than 5 seconds, then you can cast your secondary, which will reset your defensive. So Assassin's main gimmick is the defensive, which at base gives you Vanish, which allows you to evade attacks. It's an invuln until you use an attack. And during that, your damage will be increased by 30%. So you can see, yeah, there's that increase right there when you exit out of Vanish. Now, what the rotation is like is that Assassin wants to go behind the enemy because of their special, which is Assassinate. Now, Assassinate, as you can see, will deal 30% more damage if the enemy is facing away from you. And from personal experience, Assassin's damage is very dependent on backstab. If you don't backstab the enemy, you're doing peanuts for damage. So what you want to do is you ideally want to be in Vanish and then use your special. You notice that you'll have 2 charges of your special. So you can either cast one and then save the other one, or just cast both and then, wait for the cooldown to go up. Now, as you can see, the reason why we want to spam our primary after exiting Vanish is because it has a 15% chance of resetting our defensive cooldown. The secondary is not as important for Assassin because you only really use it to reset your defensive. So I'm waiting here, 5 seconds left, it resets, and then I can cast it again. Now, there are upgrades that do change the secondary to be a lot more useful. For example, the Opal Knife Juggle, which is really funny because any ability or loot with cooldown will proc it. And you can see it just spam, especially if you have something that has a very good, as you can see right here. And the secondary does slow you down at base. Notice it. And I might as well cover right now another mechanic of this game, which is you have cooldown and GCD, which is your global cooldown. GCD you can think of as once you use that skill, you're no longer able to use any other abilities except for your defensive in most cases. Some defensives do use GCD, but most of the defensives in the game do not. And so, for example, this skill, the primary, has I should just say ability, has a GCD of 1.2. So if I use it, you can see I can't do anything else until that cooldown goes down. You can notice that when I use it, all my other abilities are on GCD. Cooldown is for each skill, or each ability. So you can see here, Assassinate has a 6 cooldown per to gain back 1 use. So if I use it right now, it'll go on cooldown. If I use it again, it's fine. And you'll see I get 1 use back every 6 seconds. Now with Assassin, because it's so focused on the special to deal damage, Assassin's damage can be kind of anemic sometimes. And another thing to note is Assassin's range is not that great. You can see here that it's very easy to go out of range with this primary. The secondary is ranged, but the secondary you use pretty sparingly because you want to use it to reset your defensive. You don't really want to use it in other instances. As I mentioned before, the special is very dependent on backstab. You need to be behind the enemy to deal damage. And another mechanic I might as well mention now is targeting. So in the base game, targeting is not as important because a lot of you don't need to focus on trash mobs to deal damage to the boss, but except for Church Mouse Streets. But in the extra stages, it is pretty much mandatory that you need to understand this mechanic. So just like in another bullet hell like Toho, there is a shift. See, that's locking on. If I go in combat here, I'll just show this briefly. You can see that the circle around is a hitbox. So if I stay in here, I'll get hit. And when I focus, that hitbox becomes more visible. So you can see that's a hit. Now, the reason why this is important is because you'll notice that I'm switching between aim types right now. So if I press shift once, it will lock on to pretty much like the main boss. If I use free aim, when I hit space, that will switch to free aim, which switches to the closest target in the vicinity of your character. So this is very useful for melee characters because they want to hit a specific enemy. It's not very demonstratable here because there's only one enemy, but if there were multiple, and let's say you had like a smaller enemy you want to target, you would use that free aim to target them. Of course, it isn't perfect, and sometimes it's a little finicky on how it works. But that is the gist of targeting. Like I said, with Assassin, you definitely want to get upgrades with this character because for some stages, you'll find that Assassin's damage is a bit lacking. So either you want more consistency in terms of, let's say, using the Garnet secondary or the Opal secondary or the Sapphire secondary, which will just help you get more uptime with your defensive. And of course, there's more powerful versions of your defensive and of course, upgrading your special. There's one special that I personally wouldn't recommend, which is the Opal special because it changes Assassinate into a ranged attack. And I personally found this very finicky because sometimes the targeting would just not target the correct mob. And unlike other instances where I use Assassin, I would just get hit. So the thing with Assassin is that a lot of Assassin's abilities have pretty short range. So in a boss like Tasha on King's Arsenal, it can be difficult to get in range without playing very recklessly with the character. So that's Assassin. I personally needed quite a bit of time to learn this character before I felt rather confident in using her. But there's that. Next up, we have Heavyblade. So Heavyblade, I would consider the big bonk character. Heavyblade wants to cast her secondary, her special, her primary, and then just loop this. You can notice that when I am using the secondary, it is charging the primary and special, which is why I want to use it first. As for the defensive is purely defensive in that it doesn't provide any buffs in the base form, but what it provides is this field here, which as long as I stay in that field, I will not take damage. You and your allies will not take damage. So unlike Astra from early, the Wizard's field, Wizard is a selfish buff, whereas this is team-wide, so you can use this to help protect your allies, but in practice, I find this difficult to time with other players because most likely other players, if you're, for example, in a spread-out pattern, they probably want to stay away from you. So they won't go towards this field unless, you know, you call it out. So I personally find Heavyblade was my first character. But I've pretty much like moved off this character. I don't play them as much because I just don't find them very satisfying to play. Now, the rotation is very much, you have the secondary, which goes in a line, and it's pretty much your only ranged attack. All your other abilities are not ranged. Your special has a unique mechanic where it will launch your character towards whoever you're targeting. And during this, you'll have a brief invul. You can see it better if you look at the ruby gem here. It's very brief, and this is quite important to know, because if you are out of range of the enemy, if you're just a bit further away, you'll go towards them, and this can be a problem when, for example, you're playing with other players, or even just trying to keep your DPS up, but you're a bit too far away from the enemy. You're trying to avoid a pattern, and you jump straight into a bullet. So that is worth knowing. I would say that the primary is very important for Heavyblade, because it is a very easy, it has a very large hitbox, circular, around your character, so it's easy to land. Of all these attacks, you can see your primary, your secondary. The only one that somewhat slows you, you could say, is your special. There is a little bit of a wind up there. I'll just show it. There's a little bit of a wind up. So this is worth noting for if you want to use the invalid frames on here to dodge a specific attack, like a wave of bullets. It is worth noting. You can use it to poke. Essentially, once you lunge in, you really want to back out as fast as possible, because you do not want your invalid frames to run out and then you get hit by like an orb or a laser. So that is worth noting. Now, the reason why I described Heavyblade as a big bonk character is because her attacks do have fairly high base damage. The issue with Heavyblade, for me personally, is that Heavyblade, after the first stage, tends to fall off in damage, just because you need to really spec into loot that gives you, for example, like burn. So you want to take advantage of that high base damage to deal, for example, like a debuff, or you just want to stack on a bunch of like melee loot that will increase your damage like that. But as for upgrades, I would note upgrading your primary. There is a secondary I would be weary of, the Sapphire secondary, because it does this. So it deals no damage. It charges your special and your primary. It has a very fast GCD, so you can use it very quickly. And as you can see, I'm just holding down the secondary here, and I am schmoving. Unfortunately, initially I found this quite difficult to control. But in retrospect, there are other characters that are easier to control than this. As I'll get into in the next parts. But with Heavyblade, you definitely want to focus on increasing your base damage. Essentially, you want to do a big bonk, even if it sacrifices your GCD. The rotation might feel really good, you know, to be able to just go between your secondary, your special, your primary. If your special's on cooldown, you just alternate between your secondary and your primary to keep charging your primary. But in the long run, the damage that it does is quite anemic, especially when you get to harder bosses. And because the secondary is so short-ranged, and it's the only ranged attack that you have, it tends to be... What ends up happening, as I had in a recent run, was that some patterns you are focused on dodging, you're far away from the boss, so you can't really hit them with your special, because your special will send you into some bullets, or your primary is just too short range, so you only have your secondary, which has pretty anemic damage. As you can see here, like the Garnet one here gives like the highest damage of these, and even then, compared to, you know, other parts of Heavyblade's kit, that damage is just not as good. Right. Next up, we have Dancer. So Dancer is your party buffer class, but the thing is, Dancer's also very good with her own personal DPS. So the rotation would be something like this. You would cast your defensive, your special, and then you can either alternate between your primary and secondary until your special resets, and then cast your special, like so. Getting quite lucky here. You can see. Or you can cast your primary twice, your secondary twice, and then just alternate between the two like so. Now the reason for that is because Dancer gives a buff on her defensive. In this case, it's War Cry, which just gives you party 20% up, damage up, which is very nice, as well as erasing projectiles. Your special has a 30% chance of resetting every time your primary or your secondary is used. So you want to use this. You want to use your primary and secondary to hopefully reset that, and that's why you want to reset your special. You want to use your special first, so that way you can get your special back on cooldown and then hopefully reset it with your primary or secondary. Now, I will note that the primary, as you can see, it slows you down a little bit for Dancer. Your secondary does not slow you down. Your special does slow you down a bit, and you see that the defensive also slows you down a little bit. So Dancer has very good DPS, but you can see that Dancer really wants to cast her defensive a lot, pretty much to keep the 100% uptime. Just as soon as it goes off cooldown, you cast it, which means that you, in her kit, you're likely not going to have defensive unless you purposely save it for or have a loot that will reset it. Get that defensive back up so you can use it defensively when you need it. But Dancer works really well with, for example, Rabbit Luck. So this is another mechanic in the game that you should know. Such Rabbit Luck essentially makes it so that way, or any loot that gives you luck makes you, slightly luckier, significantly luckier. Like over here. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's, for example, second comment, give you some, the trumpet here, the rabbit foot. These things will give you some luck, and this affects percent-based chance. Rabbit luck is a very potent one that basically guarantees these things to proc. So you can see, if I cast it, I have rabbit luck, and I am just constantly resetting my defensive, or my special, sorry. So that is a very good, simple build to use. Is just focus on loot that gives you percent-based chance, and then just stack on some rabbit luck, and you're off to the races. So, as I've said, Dancer is very versatile. There's just, like, you could pivot into your special damage, you could, or your primary or secondary. There's some loot that give you specific buffs, like for example Strongman's bar here, which as long as you use your alternate between your primary and your secondary, you're just getting another extra 200 damage. Really good stuff here. Right. Next up we have Druid. So Druid, I would say, is a support slash DOT type character. So interesting thing with Druid is that at base, her defensive doesn't give any offensive utility. It's purely defensive. You can see you have this buff called Flutter Step, which increases your movement and mobility speed. So I personally use this defensive when I want to dodge some bullets, or I can't get to a circle in time, so I use it to increase my movement speed. The rotation for the character, you don't need to cast this defensive immediately because it doesn't give you any offensive value, but what you would like to do is just use your special, your secondary, and then just use your primary. You can see the primary is slowing me down a bit. This is worth noting, but another thing that slows you down even more is the secondary here. Now, as you can see, what the secondary is doing is that over 12 seconds, it's going to hit the enemy 6 times. This is a field. So essentially you lay down a DLT over time, which is very powerful with Druid. The Druid can trivialize a lot of like multi-target bosses because of this. You just cast it and then you can just focus on dodging because you're dealing damage passively. There's also the special, which is Summon Spirit, which places down a summon that will attack for you. Upgrades can change this effect. For example, this can be changed such that either, you can upgrade the base damage, you can change it so that way it does more DOT over time, or like one here, like the Ruby special here, which straight up places a effective bomb. Things like that. So you really want to focus on your secondary and your special. And the reason why is, personally, Druid's damage is kind of anemic when you're not having a single upgrade. I find that because some bosses like to move a lot, the secondary can be difficult to land. So in this case, the Ruby secondary here, I believe, increases the size. Yeah, slight increase to the field size. And you'll want to make sure that you are targeting the right boss or character, so you can make the most out of this field to deal damage. The special is very much a cast it whenever you have it goes off cooldown. It only increases your damage. You're not going to lose out on anything. And the primary, I would say, is it's okay. It doesn't really do much. It's not amazing, but it's there for when your secondary and your special are on cooldown. As you can see, Druid also has a similar, because her buffs apply to the party. As you can see, you can get different buffs, like for example, haste here, vanish, just damage, and even Warcry, essentially stealing Dancer's gimmick. Or you can just ignore it completely and just say, yeah, let's just give your team super every 30 seconds. So, yes, very team buff oriented, but I would say if you want to focus on personal damage, for example, when you're doing like a solo run, then you definitely want to get your secondary or your special upgraded. Otherwise, your damage will be kind of low. All right, so now I've covered the 5 default characters, and so in the next video I will be covering the unlockable characters that are in the base game. So with that said, this is Tish, signing off.